Welcome to the hidden corners where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind.
Hunting the Wolfman. Old man Jess Benson, cattleman and mine owner, rode across the high plateau which divided the rich grazing lands between Rock Valley and Slater Canyon. He let his horse pick its way down the steep slope to Slater Creek. Here, as the sorrel slaked its thirst, the big man in the saddle filled and lit his pipe, while his eyes moved slowly through the sprinkle of cottonwoods which fringed the creek. His cattle roamed this vast country, and a few were missing. He hoped they'd wandered down through the gully and headed along the creek bank. Well, about 50 feet upstream, close to a large boulder and partly behind a clump of stunted mesquite, half a dozen magpies were quarreling over something that the rider could not clearly distinguish. He could see something dark behind the bushes, a carcass of a cow or a steer probably, and he watched the beautiful black and white birds speculatively as they uttered their shrill, raucous cries. They fluttered about the thicket. Well, since there was a possibility that dead animal might be carrying his brand, Benson turned his horse in the direction of the birds. A minute later, having reached the spot from which he could command a clear view of the thing that lay behind the bushes, his sunburnt cheeks went ashen, and he swung himself to the ground with the exclamation of horrified surprise. Close to the thicket and 5 or 6 feet from the rock was the body of a man. He was lying partly on his side, one leg drawn up and the other outstretched, while both arms were bent under him. His face and neck were terribly torn and mangled, and his flannel shirt had been ripped half off his body, which was bruised and covered with wounds. Several paces away was a trampled felt hat, and the muzzle of a revolver peeped from beneath the body, its butt evidently clutched in the stiffened fingers of one hand. For a dozen feet around the man, the ground was torn and trampled as though a terrible struggle had taken place. For several minutes, Benson stood still and eyed the ghastly thing in horrified fascination. Long-time experience as a range rider told him that the body and the signs of conflict about it could not be more than 48 hours old. This thing had happened since a heavy rain of 2 days before, and it slowly dawned on the cattleman that the dead man was Nathan Smith, a neighbor of his who owned a small farm about 5 or 6 miles away. For some time he studied the body and the surrounding soil very carefully, noting especially that the soft earth was covered with large, dog-like tracks. And then he went to his horse and he untied his slicker from the back of the saddle. With this garment, he managed to cover the body so that the magpies could no longer get to it. Then he mounted his horse and rode off toward Elk, 10 miles away. Well, Sheriff Parker and Doc Morris, the coroner, happened to be together in the sheriff's office. They were drinking a cup of coffee when Benson entered and told his story to him. Both men listened without any particular comment, and at the end, the sheriff got to his feet. "I'll run you both out in the truck," the sheriff said. "We can reach the spot easily enough by following the old road up the creek, and then we can walk in from there." From what Benson says, this thing does not look like a crime exactly. It seems more like the work of wolves, though I never heard of any wolf attacking a man in this region, but can never tell. At any rate, we'd better go look into it as soon as we can. When the 3 men eventually reached the spot, Doc Morris lifted the slicker up and stooped over the gruesome object beneath it, while Sheriff Parker gazed at the trodden ground with interest. While the coroner made his examination, the officer paced around the thicket. He was eyeing the tracks thoughtfully. More than once he stooped to apply a pocket ruler to some especially distinct impression, and twice he whistled softly to himself. By the time the doctor's examination had ended, he was turning a speculative eye toward a dim trail which led off at right angles through the cottonwood. Returning from washing his hands at the edge of the creek, Doc Morris looked at his friend in contemplative silence, and he lit a cigar and puffed at it nervously. Well, the sheriff questioned at length, what was it? What do you think killed him? Heck if I know, Bert. I never saw anything like this before in all my experience. It was an animal of some kind, I can say that for sure. A wolf, most likely. Although, as you said earlier, the few wolves we have around here have never been known to attack humans. But the man is frightfully mangled. His jugular vein is torn out of him. Had his gun in his hand, too. It's empty. He must have fought that thing hard, whatever it was. The tracks certainly look like wolf. But I ain't never seen a wolf track that big. And there's something else, too. He hesitated as if he really didn't believe what he was about to say. Sheriff Park shivered and nodded in an absent way, his eyes still fixed on the faint trail through the trees and the weeds. You talking about the tracks? Doc Morris let out a big sigh. Yep. Remember when we were boys, the sheriff said? Remember that kid in class that disappeared? I've forgotten his name, but I remember that his body was never found. And then a couple of months later, that girl went missing. Everyone thought she'd run off with her boyfriend, but he swore up and down that he knew nothing about her disappearance. And then there was that family that was camping down by the river. And the fisherman who left all his gear and tackle that was never seen again, Morris added. Benson piped up, yeah, and lots of missing cattle and dogs and, well, even a couple of hunters. But as far as I know, there's never been a closed case. What do you think we're dealing with here? I don't know, said the sheriff. This one's different. This time we have a body, mangled as it is, and tracks that look pretty fresh. Maybe it heard you coming along and ran off before it had time to... He couldn't finish his sentence. He shook his head and frowned. Jess Benson, with horror written all over his face, stared at the two men as they talked. I don't feel safe out here on horseback. I've dealt with a lot of beasts in my years here, cougars and wolves and bear, but this one here is the devil himself. Sheriff Parker made no answer, but Benson caught a glance between Morris and him that he didn't like. There was something they were talking about, and there was something they weren't telling him. Sheriff Parker continued to search the ground around the body a few minutes longer, as though he wished to make doubly sure that his suspicions were correct. Then he helped the others wrap the body in a blanket, and they carried it to the back of the truck. And 5 minutes later, save for the trampled ground and some dull brown, ominous stains on the grass, there was no apparent sign of the tragedy. Well, 2 hours later, seated at his desk with that cigar between his teeth, Sheriff Parker squinted through his glasses at Doc Morris, who sat opposite him. I tell you, Doc, the sheriff was saying, if I had not been studying the results of this creature's work for the past 6 weeks, I wouldn't believe that such a creature existed. I grew up hearing about this beast, but I always thought it was legend. You know, the kind of stuff that parents make up to keep the young'uns home at night. And then when you add up all the cases of missing people and animals over the last 30-some years, it's got me wondering just what kind of beast we're dealing with. Well, aside from its tracks, the coroner mused, no one around here that I know of has ever had an eyewitness account. It leaves the track in the ground larger by far than any full-grown timber wolf, and it certainly can fight. Benson said his hounds were mangled by it last week, and now Smith. He was a very powerful man and armed. But so far as we know, the thing killed him and got away unscathed. The man's body looked as if it had been struck by a train. The chest and sides might have been beaten in with a sledgehammer. His clothes were torn to shreds, and, well, as for his throat, the less said about that, the better. Sheriff Parker didn't say anything for a few minutes. And getting to his feet, he began to pace, slowly back and forth across the room. Fingers were interlaced behind his back, and his head bowed in the way he sometimes did when he was in deep thought. He was struggling with a problem the like of which he'd never experienced before. Somehow he had to find a way to identify and then get rid of this beast that was terrorizing the valley. So what we're dealing with here is larger than a full-grown timber wolf, has the strength of a grizzly, and is quiet and cunning as a cougar. But what really has me puzzled are the tracks we saw. They were elongated and looked almost human, but enormous, like some giant, barefoot, half-man, half-wolf beast. It just doesn't add up. Well, almost 6 weeks before Jack Moore, a stock inspector, whose duties often carried him far out into the thinly settled portions of the county, had noticed several cattle had been brutally mauled to death. Cattle mutilations were becoming a common sight this far out in the country, and it was troubling for both the ranchers and the Stockmen's Association. It didn't help that the newspapers, they just sensationalized the story, and then on top of that, you had all the crazies that claimed it was UFOs and alien abductions and such. Well, Jack was a cattleman, a third-generation rancher, and he'd never seen anything like this. But he wasn't about to believe it was something supernatural. At first, the authorities and the ranchers had attributed the cattle maulings and mutilations to timber wolves, for the sole reason that they could attribute it to nothing else. The tracks around the bodies, though exceedingly large, were shaped like wolves, and the bodies themselves had been torn and mangled as if by some carnivorous animal. Jack hadn't seen the other tracks, the ones that looked more elongated, but even if he had, he wouldn't have believed his eyes. People saw what they were willing to see, and nothing outside of that existed. Well, soon after the cattle, a dozen sheep were killed in their pasture. Then, on the heels of this, Buck Humphrey, a prosperous rancher whose word was beyond dispute, with 2 of his hired men, had seen something rush through their hayfield right at tree line. Something they couldn't make out, though it was broad daylight. They could see the tall hay wave and shake, and they could even hear the creature as it thrashed about there, but it held back in the shadows. Well, they drew their rifles, but they couldn't see the beast well enough to get a good shot. Then Jess Benson's hounds, a pack of 14 which had never met its match, and in many encounters with wolves and coyotes, had been soundly whooped. The 3 of them killed outright in a fight with some kind of animal. Now, as a climax to this whole business had come Nathan Smith's horrible death, and no man could say who or what would be the next victim. As he thought over all these things for the 100th time, Sheriff Parker racked his brain to form some plan for trapping and killing the beast. It was his job. He knew there must be a way, somehow, to make an end to the terror, even though the most skillful trappers and hunters in the county had failed to discover it. The animal's range was known. It seemed for the most part to frequent the country between Slater Creek and White Horse Mountain, probably because the region contained plenty of timber and natural shelter. Well, Sheriff Parker was deep in thought when his phone rang. "Howdy, Sheriff. Jack Moore here. Sorry to bother you this late, but we got a problem out here on Humphreys. Old man Buck is dead, and you're not going to believe what we found out here." Sheriff Parker grabbed his Stetson off the hat rack and headed for the door. He called out to his deputy to lock up for the night and ran to his truck. It was a good hour's drive out to the Humphreys ranch, and Parker called up Morris to come along. Morris was waiting outside when the sheriff pulled up at his place. "What's up? What happened?" he asked. "Well, old Buck Humphrey's dead. Jack Moore's out there with that other hired hands. Says they found something out there that we won't believe. Wouldn't say anything else, just say I got to see it to believe it." Doc Morris just stared at him, had nothing to say. The 2 men sat in silence the rest of the way as Parker sped toward Humphrey's ranch. One of the hired hands was waiting at the gate to let the sheriff's truck in. Then he closed the gate and followed his dust in an old white pickup. The Humphreys homestead was lit up like a lantern, lights shining from all the windows. Buck's wife, Columbine, she was sitting on the front porch, and Jack had his arm around her, comforting her as she cried onto his shoulder. He gently handed her over to another hired hand who helped her back into the house, and Jack walked over to the 2 men and just got there. Jack told the sheriff that he'd been out on the range earlier that afternoon inspecting cattle. He was on horseback when he spotted what looked like an enormous grizzly in the far distance, and he heard Buck's dog barking up a storm. Whatever it was that dog was barking at, it looked too big to be a wolf, so thinking it was a bear and possibly within shooting distance, he pulled his rifle from the scabbard and loosed a shot at it. He watched as the beast stood up, looked his direction, then let out an ear-splitting roar and ran off into the trees. "Ran off," he repeated, "on 2 legs. And then he saw Buck's dog chasing the beast off into the timber. He took off running his horse at top speed towards the site, and he found Buck Humphrey laying there, his guts torn out of his stomach and half his arm torn off. He quickly removed his neck bandana and tied a tourniquet around what was left of Buck's arm and removed his shirt to try to staunch the bleeding of Buck's stomach, but he knew Buck didn't stand a chance. Buck was trying to whisper something but couldn't find his voice. He pointed, though, over toward some bushes near where he lay, and Jack's eyes followed the direction of the pointing finger. There in the bushes lay Buck's horse, dead and ripped to shreds. But what Buck was pointing at was not the horse, but the massive tracks that surrounded the horse. They were humanoid in shape, but ended in long, curving claws like a wolf's. And this was not something Jack's eyes could believe. There was nothing Jack could do for Buck. Buck had taken his last breath, and the horse was dead, and the dog was gone. Jack decided the best thing he could do was race back to the house and get help. Jack and the ranch hands thought it was best to wait until the sheriff and the doc arrived to investigate the scene. And when Jack finally finished telling his story, it was getting near dark, so they gathered flashlights and lanterns and went by horseback out to the site where Jack had last seen Buck, their guns at the ready in case the beast had returned to the kill site. When they finally reached the spot, they found Buck's mangled body and the horse, and with their flashlights they could see numerous tracks, enormous and human-like, yet they did not end in human-shaped toes, but more like the pads of dogs with claw points that extended past the print. Man or beast? Man and beast? Suddenly the men heard a noise running towards them, and in unison they all raised their guns at the ready. But before anyone could let loose a shot, one of the hired hands yelled, "It's Old Blue, Buck's dog, don't shoot." Out of the bushes that lined the timber came the Old Blue Aussie, running straight at him. He was unhurt and had apparently abandoned his chase of the beast, and was lucky that it had not caught him, and lucky he hadn't been shot by the surprised and anxious men. Well, they loaded Buck onto a travois and headed back to the ranch house. They'd have to come back in the morning to take some plaster casts of the prints. Sheriff Parker poured himself another cup of coffee. It had been a long night. Who would be the next victim? Now that Jack had actually sighted the beast, at least they kind of knew what they were up against. But what exactly did that mean? A creature that is supposed to exist only in legends? Were there more? And if we were to believe that giant wolf-like creatures actually existed, then does that open up the possibility for werewolves and vampires too? Sheriff Parker snickered under his breath. This story would create a media storm. And were they ready for that? And the phone rang. It was Jack Moore. "Morning, Sheriff. I've been doing some thinking and I might have come up with a plan." An hour later, 4 men sat in a booth at Mary's Diner drinking coffee. Jack Moore, Sheriff Parker, Doc Morris, and Jess Benson. "Let's pack up our horses and plenty of guns and ammo and start tracking that beast," Jess said. "Now, think about it. All animals need to drink. What water source is out there besides the creek?" "Well, Silver Lake is 10 miles from here. I know that's not far, but I say we dam up the creek temporarily so there's no water flow below Clark's Meadow. That'll draw it up on the hill. Now it could head to Silver Lake, but I doubt it. I think the food is plentiful here, with what all the cattle and sheep in the valley, so I think it'll stay in this general area. We dam up the water and force it to Clark's Meadow, where we'll have a posse of men hiding out in tree platforms and duck blinds. It's about all we can do." "Well, it's worth a try," Sheriff Parker replied. "I'll put out word and draw some deputies and rangers from the neighboring county, maybe gather a few ranchers to help us. Let's see what we can pull together, and I'll get someone up there to dam that creek today." Well, a week later, 10 men unloaded their horse trailers at various locations around Clark's Meadow. They knew they had to take this creature by surprise, and they had no doubt it would be watching them. Old Jess Benson had moved some cattle out to graze the meadow and hardly taken notice of a couple of them missing. A small sacrifice to pay to rid this valley of this monster predator. Well, far up on Benson's Ridge, Sheriff Parker and Doc Morris met up with Jess, who was surveying a couple of dead steers. The lifeless forms that littered the ground had been badly mangled and half-eaten. They took it as a good sign that the beast was hunting and he was close by. "What's the plan, Sheriff?" Benson asked. "We've got rangers and deputies circling the meadow on horseback looking for tracks. We'll rendezvous tonight at Benson's Gulch and everyone will get their placement. I know it's a long shot, but we've got to hope that the beast will come up the meadow to drink. The creek's been dammed and the water's already flowing into the meadow." Now, that evening, they built a campfire and everyone sat around it. They discussed what they'd seen or hadn't seen during their earlier scouting missions. Several tracks had been followed, and those who had seen tracks compared notes on size, stride, direction, and whether they'd seen single tracks from one beast or if there was the possibility of more than one. They needed to know how many they were dealing with. No one there that night had ever seen tracks like this before, and everyone was really on edge. In the days following up to this gathering, several of the men had read everything they could get their hands on regarding, wolves and werewolves and wendigos and Bigfoot. Books on the subject suggested that while wolves are territorial and they travel in packs, the lone wolf's not uncommon. But wendigos and werewolves are nearly always singular. A wendigo or a werewolf. It was still difficult to wrap their heads around the possibility that this is what they were dealing with here. These were legends, and not one man in the group was the type to believe in these kinds of imaginary beasts. They were countrymen. They had to deal with realistic things every day. But with the recent death of Nathan Smith, they knew that whatever this beast was, it would just as likely hunt and kill a human as it would a cow or sheep, and if they didn't get to it first. As they sat around the campfire, they could hear a wolf howling in the distance. Its long, drawn-out cry that all men recognize instinctively. Melodious, yet with a tone that sends a shudder right up your spine. Someone in the circle began telling a story about the 3 calls of the hunting wolf. The long, drawn-out, deep howl that tells of game discovered, but too strong for the finder to manage alone. And then the higher ululation, like a ringing or swelling in the cry of the pack on a hot scent. And then the sharp bark, coupled with a short howl that, seeming least of all, is yet the sound of doom, for this is the cry of closing in on the prey. Now, buffalo used to roam this valley, followed by bands of wolves that preyed on the sick, the weak, and the wounded. When the buffalo were exterminated, the wolves suffered, until the cattle came along. The ranchman had fought them ever since. Cowboys that were out of work could always make a few bucks killing wolves. The ranchers supplied them with traps and poison. Some cowboys became so good at this that they became known as wolvers. Benson remarked that his grandfather had been a wolver, and he remembered the old man saying that never in all his experience had he known a gray wolf to attack a human being. Times had changed. Outside in the trees, the coyotes had begun their yapping chorus, followed by a wolf's howl. 2 of the dogs arose, and with bristling manes, they began barking. Everyone, including the dogs, were on edge, and they knew danger was nearby. Everyone was up and loaded before the first light of dawn crested the horizon. They agreed on their prospective locations, and that if they should see anything, 1 shot meant attention, and another shot 10 seconds later meant come now. Anything other than that, such as rapid gunfire, that was to mean trouble. The tracks were easy to find, but seemed to lead the men to all sorts of roundabout forays. Here they lead to an old cow skull. Here he had shied off and swung cautiously upwind. There at length he had mounted a low hill and sat down. The dog's hair bristled as they sniffed those places, and they got excited with the scent. Sheriff Parker and Doc Morris were riding together and crested a tall hill to get a better viewpoint of the meadow down below. The ground was littered with fresh tracks. It was clear the beast had been watching the men from up on that hill and could not be far away. Well, the chase led downward to the low valley just below where the creek had been dammed. Within another mile, the tracks led into a willow thicket. "I don't like the looks of this," Doc Morris said. "It feels like a trap." Just then, the 2 men saw a horse bounding up the game path through the thick willows, as if being chased. A saddle was on the horse, but there was no rider. "That is Tim's horse," Sheriff Parker yelled. He spurred his horse into a run in the direction of the lone horse had come from, and there, up ahead around the bend, was the ranger, Tim Bradshaw. The ranger had fallen but was still alive. He was wounded in several places and had a large gash across his forehead, and his chest was scored with the marks of giant claws. The buzzards were circling ever lower, experts at recognizing oncoming death. Tim was barely conscious when the men reached him. They tied a tourniquet round his chest and to staunch the bleeding, and a bandana over the gash on his head, and helped him to sit up and take a drink from the canteen. Sheer courage and the will to ignore the pain that racked his entire body kept Tim alive. He could barely move. He wiped the blood from his eyes, but his vision was fogged. His horse had bolted from the fear of whatever had attacked the ranger. But now the big horse cautiously walked back up the game trail and stood motionless near the other two horses. It called for an almost superhuman effort for Tim to mount the horse, and with Sheriff Parker and Doc Morris assisting him up into the saddle. He made no attempt to sit erect. Instead, he leaned far forward, fighting desperately against the constantly increasing nausea that threatened to deprive him of his consciousness, and probably his life. The sheriff led the horse and the rider out of the willows into the clearing of the meadow. The buzzards were still circling overhead. Well, the afternoon sun was blazing down on Sentinel Butte as the men returned to the camp to get Tim loaded into a truck and taken to the hospital in town. As they reached the turn to where the truck and the horse trailer were parked, a deep-toned howl came from the flat valley below, followed by a number of higher-pitched howls and answering chorus. It was the hunting cry of the wolves. Doc Morris drove Tim into town to the hospital, and Sheriff Parker joined Jess Benson and Jack Moore to relay what had happened in the willows. They saw two other rangers coming out of the trees over by the creek and rode up to them to inquire what they'd seen. Apparently, tracks were everywhere. Either this thing was keeping a mighty range or there was more than one of them. They couldn't help feel that this creature knew their every move and was always one step ahead of them. Well, before Tim had been knocked off his horse, he had seen the creature dart out of the willows and rear up on two mighty legs, raking him with razor-sharp claws. Just as the beast swung for his head, he ducked, and the horse reared at the same time, knocking him clean off his horse. This probably saved his life. The horse took off running, and the beast ran after the horse. It seemed to be more interested in the chase rather than stopping to kill and eat its fallen prey. Well, the horse had escaped simply because the beast ran when it heard Parker and Morris. It was like a game of cat and mouse. The sheriff shot one shot up in the air to get the attention of the other scouts, and he waited 10 seconds, and then he shot another signal. Remember, that was their come on in signal. Well, it was late afternoon, and he wanted to make sure everyone was accounted for before dusk. They cooked a good dinner over the campfire, and they made plans for the following day. "I don't want anyone out there alone. Tim Bradshaw should have had a partner with him today. I thought we'd agreed on that. Now he's sitting up there in the hospital and lucky to be alive. We can't have any mistakes. Agreed?" Everyone did agree to that. The sky was thick with stars, and the forest was silent. There was no wind, no stir of branches. Only the crackle of snapping twigs was audible from time to time as the little night creatures moved around through the underbrush. Not even the coyotes called that night. The silence was eerie and unsettling. Just like cowboys of the Old West, they had placed their sleeping bags in a circle around the campfire for warmth and protection, but not one of them was able to sleep. There was a frosty touch to the air as the men drank their morning coffee and prepared for the day's scouting. The forest was silent. There was no wind, no stir of branches. Only the crackle of the snapping twigs was audible from time to time. They loaded their provisions on their horses and they set out in groups of 2 and 4 to the various scouting locations. Parker and Morris rode out with the 2 Garrison brothers, following a line of tracks that ascended some 800 to 1,000 feet up Sentinel Butte to a well-worn game trail. The trees were thinner and more sparsely placed up here in the higher elevation. The silver birch and the sumac were already turning into fall colors, but there were still red currants on the bushes and an abundance of wild rose hips. The cattle don't generally wander up this high, but there were deer and elk tracks as well as an occasional pile of bear scat. The men came upon a quiet pool fed by a clear crystal stream and stopped for a moment to let their horses drink. It was obvious that their prey had stopped here as well. Fresh tracks could be seen in the mud, crossing the stream, and were very distinct in the marshy ground above the pool. Parker got down off his horse to take a measurement of the track when he caught sight of movement in the trees about 40 yards from where he stood. He raised his finger to his lips, then made a motion with his hand to indicate the direction he saw the movement to the other men, who quickly raised their rifles and silenced their horses. Cautiously stepping outside of the protection of the trees, a giant wolf, larger than the men had ever seen, started towards them. The giant beast's head was lowered, his enormous shoulders hunched slightly forward as if he was preparing to spring upon them like a cat stalking its prey. The men watched in awe as the wolf-like creature raised his head and cried out a blood-curdling, ear-splitting howl. No one moved. Each one waited for the other to make the first move. Their raised rifles at the ready, men and beast stared into each other's eyes for a length of time that seemed like forever. A snarl and a low growl could be heard. If he would just come a little closer, they would get good, clean shots. Suddenly, from down in the valley, several shots rang out, taking all four men by surprise. Involuntarily, and just for a split second, in unison, they glanced toward the loud explosion of gunfire, giving the giant wolf the opportunity to spring at them. All four men began firing their rifles at the giant beast as it closed in on them. The wolf took repeated blows, but the bullets merely knocked it back for a fraction of a second, and then it continued its charge toward the men. Hank Garrison's horse spooked and nearly threw him, but Hank managed to stay the saddle and got off one more shot straight into the giant beast's head. It let out an enormous roar and fell to its feet, scrambling to right itself, and more gunfire tore into its massive bulk. It was down. The men stayed back, ready to fire more if needed. They got a good look at the beast as it lay there in the final throes of death. It was stretched out and with great muscular thighs quivering. The beast's head and shoulders were enormous. The fur was dark and matted under the blood that was pulling up around him. The rush of excitement turned into a sense of relief as they waited for the beast to breathe his final breaths. The horses were nervous, their nostrils flaring in and out as the giant wolf succumbed. It was as if the horses sensed the kill and felt the soul of the giant beast leave its body. Hank's horse was pawing at the ground, whinnying, and he turned it into a couple of circles to try to steady it. It was just too much for that horse, and he strained to bolt away. Hank let it fall behind the others, and he desperately tried to calm him. They didn't want to leave the kill, not until they were absolutely sure that the beast was dead. But the shots that had rang out in the valley below had them disturbed. Sheriff Parker told the doc to head back with Hank towards a meadow and see if the other rangers needed assistance. He'd stay here with Lance Garrison to watch over the beast and keep an eye on the surroundings. Hank and Doc headed out. Parker pulled his pistol out of its holster to put a final bullet in the beast's skull. They still didn't know if there were more of them. Lance kept his rifle pointed at the beast's head while Parker got off his horse and walked within 10 feet. There was no more quivering of the muscles, no visible signs of the chest contracting with breath. He raised his pistol to fire one shot into the massive head when he noticed a barely perceptible shudder. It made him jump back just a bit, probably just the natural contraction of muscles, as is common in death, he thought to himself. He aimed his pistol and fired. The features of the beast seemed to have changed, just slightly, but enough for Sheriff Parker to notice. Lance tied the horses up to a nearby tree and knelt down next to Parker, watching the strange transformation that was taking place. It was barely perceptible, yet the body seemed to be changing, shrinking right before their eyes. For another 20 minutes, the two men knelt beside the beast, their transfixed gaze on the slowly changing animal form in front of them. The giant extended forehead appeared to be receding. The neck, which was previously the size of a fully grown man's waist, it was getting narrower, and the shoulders appeared to be shrinking and smoothing. Lance broke off a large branch from a nearby tree and measured the length of the body with the stick. The men wished the others would get up there to see the transformation taking place. It was a sure thing no one would believe them. In the valley below, Hank and Doc reached the meadow after more than an hour of brisk riding. Several of the other riders were already rendezvoused at the campsite. Doc yelled out, "Hey there, what was all that shooting about?" "Simmons had the beast treed," Tom Horn hollered back. "What? Wolves don't climb trees," Hank exclaimed. Doc and Hank dismounted and tied up their horses, then joined the group. "Tell us what happened," Doc said. Well, Tom Horn proceeded to tell the story yet again. He and Simmons had been across the meadow near the willows where Tim had had the accident the day before. Both of them had dogs, and as they got close to the creek, the dogs started barking and ran into the willows. Tom and Simmons followed, rifles drawn. All of a sudden, a beast came bounding up the game trail with both dogs barking at its heels, heading straight for the two men on horseback. It reared up on two mighty legs, took a great swipe at one of the dogs, and lunged toward the men who were both emptying their ammo into this giant beast. It turned and ran toward a stand of lodgepole pine and climbed up the tree like a cat. The dogs, they circled around it like they'd treat a squirrel. Well, Simmons had a shotgun, and Tom reloaded his rifle, and they shot and killed the beast. It took several swings at him, and then it fell out of the tree. Then the damnedest thing happened, Tom said. You're not going to believe the rest of the story, Doc. Meanwhile, Lance and Parker were watching the other wolf beast go through a strange, unnatural transformation themselves. Neither of them could believe their eyes, and if there weren't two of them, they'd have swore it was their imagination getting the best of them. The wolf lying there in front of them was no longer a wolf. Lying there with blood pooling around his wounds was none other than Gunther Yeager. And across the meadow, a good 5 miles away from her husband, lay the body of Hannah Yeager. The Yeagers had moved to the valley from Germany many years ago. They were quiet folk, struck to themselves mostly, didn't like to socialize, and they really weren't very neighborly. They owned a big spread about 15 miles from Buck Humphrey's ranch, but mostly they grew corn and alfalfa. Thinking back on it now, the year they moved to the valley was about the time when the deer population seemed to dwindle. It was also the year that the young boy went missing. They probably accounted for many of the other, if not all, the missing person and missing animal cases over the past 30-some years. The rangers gathered up the bodies and took them back to town. The newspapers would sport the headline, "Couple killed in hunting accident." Not one man in the scouting party wanted the truth to get out. It was just too strange a story. Nobody would believe it anyway. Would you?